What if a teacher mocked a quiet black boy for claiming his dad worked at the Pentagon only for the truth to walk through the classroom door wearing a badge that stopped time? This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Stay until the end. It started with a laugh. Not a cruel one, not loud or obvious. Just a flicker of amusement too quick for discipline but sharp enough to cut the kind of laugh you hear in marble hallways wrapped in wealth and politeness. The kind that says, "You're not one of us, are you?" Most stories begin with action. This one begins with doubt, the kind of quiet, polished doubt that hides behind smiles and silk ties, the kind that doesn't ask, "Are you lying because it's already decided you are?" At Fairmount Academy, truth had a dress code. And Elijah Carter, he had the wrong wardrobe. Fairmount stood on the edge of Boston's Beacon Hill like a private monument to legacy, with its Gothic arches, ivy-covered walls, and chandeliers imported from Prague. It didn't just teach curriculum, it curated futures. Here children were groomed, not taught. Their last names were whispered with respect before their talents were even tested. The parking lot was a gallery of Teslas and Aston Martins. Parents shook hands like senators exchanged glances, like stock tips. And somewhere in the middle of that manicured perfection walked a boy who didn't belong but knew it better than anyone, Elijah Carter. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he didn't have a last name that echoed in golf clubs or alumni halls. But what he did have was the weight of two worlds on his shoulders and the kind of quiet intelligence that rarely got applause until it was too late. Some boys are raised to chase legacy. Elijah was raised to protect it. His father, Darius Carter, was a mystery to most polite, reserved, always in control. The kind of man who didn't explain himself because men like him didn't need to. Neighbors said he worked in computers. In reality, Darius was one of the Pentagon's lead cyber operations specialists. He didn't design firewalls. He built digital battlegrounds. But none of that mattered in the hallways of Fairmount, where respect was earned not by skill, but by assumption. Elijah had learned early that truth didn't always matter. What mattered was perception, so he became quiet, careful, tactical. Every morning he slipped on his pressed navy blazer, adjusted the knot of his too-tight tie, and walked into a world where his father's badge couldn't protect him. Not here. Not where status was currency and difference was a liability. He watched how the teachers spoke to him with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. He noticed how classmates greeted him with nods, a beat too late. He observed, cataloged, analyzed. Not numbers, people patterns, power. And he knew. He knew that one day the truth would have to speak louder than he could, but he didn't expect it to start with a school assignment. It came innocently enough, a soft printed sheet handed out by Ms. Halbrook, the kind of teacher who said inclusion a lot, but only ever made eye contact with the front row. Career Presentation Week, the paper read, "Tell the class what your parent does for a living and how their work helps the world." Harmless on paper. But Elijah saw the landmine hidden in plain sight. He'd seen this play out before. Students bragging about IPOs, pilot fathers who flew senators across continents, mothers who advised tech billionaires. The presentations weren't about sharing, they were about showing off. A competition in disguise. He came home that evening and stared at the paper like it was a trap. Darius was in the kitchen dicing vegetables with the same precision he used to write encryption algorithms. Elijah approached slowly. "Dad," he asked, "should I tell them?" Darius didn't look up. "Tell them what?" "What you do, where you work." Now the knife paused. Darius looked at his son, not startled, just still. "Do you want to?" he asked. "I don't know. I think they won't believe me." Darius washed his hands, dried them slowly, and sat across the table. Then he said something Elijah would never forget. "Son, the truth doesn't always win, but it never runs. If they doubt you, let them. Just don't ever doubt yourself. Elijah nodded, but inside he wasn't sure. Not yet. The next day at school, the whisper started early. He heard one girl say, "His dad's probably a driver." Another muttered, "I heard he lives in Dorchester." Like geography was a sin. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't correct them. He simply sat at his desk and wrote a single sentence at the top of his presentation notes. "My father protects the country from enemies no one sees." That sentence sat like fire in his chest. He carried it home like a secret. On the bus ride, he stared out the window, watching the city blur past. All the while, something inside him began to shift. He knew Fairmount wouldn't welcome the truth with open arms, but he was done whispering. At home that night, he and Darius reviewed the slideshow together. No details, just enough to explain, no names, no missions, just true truth wrapped in silence. And then Elijah asked the question he hadn't dared ask before. "Will you come?" Darius looked at him. His answer was simple: "I'll be there." He said it the way he did everything, without hesitation, without noise. And that night, for the first time in weeks, Elijah slept without grinding his teeth. But sleep didn't erase the feeling. Fairmount was a fortress, and Elijah had just chosen to walk in carrying a story no one wanted to hear. He didn't know what would happen when he stood in front of that class. He didn't know how deep the disbelief ran. And he didn't know that someone far beyond the school gates was already watching. Someone who had nothing to do with presentations or teachers or peer approval. Someone who did believe him, because they had been tracking Darius Carter for years. And this little boy's honesty, it had just lit up a beacon in the dark. If you were Elijah, what would you do? A, stay silent to avoid ridicule, even if it means hiding the truth. B, speak your truth even if no one believes you. Comment A or B below and tell us why. We read every answer. The morning sunlight crept through the arched windows of Fairmount Academy like it was nervous to touch the truth. Friday had arrived. Presentation Day, a day designed to celebrate the bright minds and privileged lineages that pass through those pristine halls. But for Elijah Carter, it felt less like celebration and more like an execution, one where the blade wasn't steel but perception, and the crowd didn't cheer. They chuckled. The classroom buzzed with a certain electricity that only privilege can produce. Not excitement, not fear, but the confidence of children who had never once been doubted. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing the world was made in your image. Desks were lined in perfect rows, each one a small stage. Each student had a slideshow queued up on the mounted projector, their voices rehearsed, their smiles prepared. And at the front of it all stood Mizzy Halbrook, presiding like a judge at a cotillion tablet in hand, voice syrupy with encouragement, but only for some. She greeted each child's name with a familiarity tailored by parental donation levels. Tyler, I can't wait to hear about your dad's development project in the Cayman Islands. Lila, I'm sure your mom's work in AI ethics will blow us away again this year. The room laughed in all the right places. It clapped on cue and no one questioned a thing. Why would they? The truth was whatever the loudest voice in a silk collar declared it to be. Elijah sat 2 rows from the back, hands folded, notes untouched. His presentation was already printed in his head like code burned into a hard drive. He wasn't nervous about forgetting anything. He was nervous about being erased. He looked over at the door. Darius hadn't arrived yet, but he said he would come. He always did. Still, Elijah's stomach twisted. One by one, classmates took their turns. The screen flickered with slides of corporate towers, smiling family portraits on yachts, graphs showing imaginary revenue from family startups. "My dad closed a $4 million deal last week," said one. My mom's a senior policy advisor in D.C., beamed another. The class clapped. Of course. No one asked for proof. No one laughed, because at Fairmount Prestige needed no receipts. And then it happened. Ms. Halbrook glanced at her tablet and smiled thinly. Next up, Elijah Carter. The room didn't groan. It didn't mock yet, but a subtle shift occurred. A breath held, a smirk exchanged, a moment of quiet that wasn't respectful. It was suspicious. Elijah stood slowly. The back of his knees ached from the tension. His palms were dry, but his throat wasn't. He cleared it once, took his place at the front of the class, and looked out at faces already waiting to disbelieve him. He began. My name is Elijah Carter. My father works in cybersecurity infrastructure. At the Pentagon, the room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. A single sharp scoff broke the silence. Colton, the boy whose family donated the new STEM lab, tilted his head sideways and muttered, "Sure he does." Laughter followed. Not loud, not chaotic, just enough to send a clear signal. You're not one of us. Ms. Halbrook didn't stop it. She didn't say, let him finish. Instead, she cocked her head and smiled in that way adults do when they're pretending not to doubt a child. And what exactly does he do at the Pentagon? Elijah. Elijah paused. He could lie. He could say software engineer. He could say it, but he didn't. He leads a team that protects U.S. networks from foreign cyber threats. His work helps prevent attacks before they happen. Another laugh this time from Lila, the biotech girl. So he's like a hacker for the government. More giggles. One boy made an exaggerated typing motion with his hands. Still Elijah stood. He's not a hacker, he said evenly. He's a strategist. He defends critical infrastructure before it's breached. Oh, Colton said louder now. So like a janitor, but for firewalls. The laugh this time was meaner. It had teeth. Elijah's ears burned, but his voice didn't crack. His body stayed still. On the inside, it was war. But on the outside, he was his father's son, composed clear and unmovable. And then came the worst blow. Ms. Halbrook leaned casually against her podium, voice light with faux charm. Well, that's quite the imagination, she said. But let's remember to stick to real jobs. Next time, okay? No one clapped. No one gasped. Because no one saw what had just happened. A child had told the truth, and an adult had called him a liar. That's the thing about ridicule in places like Fairmount. It doesn't need to shout. It wears pearls and corrects your grammar, while it dismantles your dignity. Elijah returned to his seat. No one looked at him, not even Leo, his closest friend who sat with lips pressed in a tight line, his eyes locked on his desk. Shame didn't burn. It chilled. It settled in his bones, slow and paralyzing. He thought of his father again. The way he said, even if they doubt, you don't doubt yourself. He repeated that line over and over in his head like a mantra. At recess, no one mentioned the presentation, not because they forgot, but because silence was a more effective exile than confrontation. Elijah walked the perimeter of the schoolyard alone. Later that day, just before dismissal, he sat in the library window, watching the parking lot. And then there he was, Darius Carter, navy suit, no smile, just presence. He didn't approach like other parents, no wave, no open arms, just a nod, a gesture, a confirmation. Elijah understood. At dinner that night, Elijah barely ate. He pushed rice around his plate with a fork. They laughed, he said quietly. Darius didn't ask who. They didn't believe me. Even Mrs. Halbrook. She made it worse. For a long moment, Darius didn't respond. Then he said, "Did you tell the truth?" "Yes." "Then that's the only part that matters." But it didn't change anything. Darius's jaw flexed. Elijah could see the shift in his posture, the way stillness replaced anger. Controlled, strategic. Then Darius said 3 words, "I'll be there." Not as a father trying to impress a classroom, not to validate his child through status, but to remind a room full of disbelievers what real authority looks like when it walks in the door. And when it does, it doesn't need to speak loudly. It just needs to exist. Elijah nodded slowly. He didn't feel better, but he felt seen. He didn't feel powerful, but he felt protected. That night, the stars above their townhouse seemed to burn a little clearer. Somewhere beyond the horizon, people were building empires of assumption and illusion. But Elijah Carter had chosen something else. He had chosen the truth. And soon the truth would choose him back. The silence before a storm doesn't always come with thunderheads. Sometimes it's the quiet click of a door unlocking, the steady rhythm of shoes on polished floors, the breath just before a truth walks in wearing a suit and changes everything. Parents' Day at Fairmount Academy was less about education and more about theater. It was choreographed, every smile, every welcome, every handshake, rehearsed to precision. The school glistened. Faculty wore their best. Students wore their second best because the best had already been seen. And the building itself felt like it knew it was on display, proud and sterile like a luxury showroom. The air smelled of coffee from French presses and cologne, too expensive for description. Laughter flowed like a curated playlist, smooth, tasteful, interrupted only by bursts of ambition disguised as parental small talk. And at the center of it all stood Room 4B, Ms. Halbrook's class. She was radiant today, her hair coiffed in a manner that suggested both restraint and power. Her pearl necklace gleamed like punctuation on the performance she was about to orchestrate. She stood by the classroom door like a museum docent, greeting guests with strategic warmth. "Mr. Whitman, I hear your son's project on global finance is brilliant. Oh, Mrs. Green, you always bring such thoughtful snacks, gluten-free and delightful." Each compliment was a chess move, each glance a subtle hierarchy. Check. And then, as if on cue, the room began to fill. Parents took their seats at the back of the classroom, smiling at each other, nodding. Students sat beside their presentations, their projects polished, their voices rehearsed. Elijah Carter sat in the third row from the front. His project sat unopened. He hadn't practiced a thing that morning. His palms were still. His heart was not. He had woken early dressed in his pressed uniform, combed his hair without being told, and sat at the breakfast table, barely touching his food. His father had watched him quietly. No questions, no affirmations, just presence. Then, with a calm so complete it bordered on spiritual, Darius had said only, "I'll see you soon." And now, as Elijah stared at the classroom door, that promise felt like an anchor, heavy steady. The presentations began. One by one, children stepped forward and spoke with well-bred confidence. "My mom advises 2 U.S. senators on climate policy. My dad runs a chain of medical startups in biotech and AI. My parents just launched a venture fund for sustainable fashion." Each sentence dropped into the room like an investment pitch, and the applause followed like a standing ovation, even when no one was standing. Ms. Halbrook offered her best smiles to the most impressive families. She applauded with a finesse reserved only for power. Even her nods had hierarchy. Then she glanced down at her tablet scrolling through the name list and paused. Her voice didn't rise, her eyes didn't widen, but there was a hitch so small It would be imperceptible if you weren't watching Elijah Carter, she said. The room shifted not in volume, but in focus. A subtle synchronized tightening of posture, like everyone had just sensed a change in temperature but didn't want to name it. Elijah stood. No tremble, no rush. He walked slowly to the front, each step deliberate, not out of defiance, but because that's what you do when you've already been judged. You carry your truth like it weighs more than gold. He turned to face the room. "My name is Elijah Carter," he said. His voice was clear, not loud, not rehearsed, just honest. "My father works at the Pentagon. He leads cybersecurity operations for national infrastructure defense." There was a silence, but not out of awe. It was the same silence that comes before a storm surge, still suspicious, waiting to pounce. Colton, sitting in the back row with his blazer collar popped and smug entitlement plastered across his face, tilted his head. "Your dad works at the Pentagon," he said just loud enough. Elijah nodded. Colton smirked. "What's he do there?" "Mop the servers." A few kids laughed, not full laughter, the kind that slides in between your ribs and settles behind your lungs. Quiet, cruel, and cold. Miss Halbrook didn't intervene. In fact, her lips twitched upward almost imperceptibly. Now, her voice sang. "Let him finish." Elijah didn't flinch. He's responsible for protecting government systems from foreign cyber attacks. That includes infrastructure, healthcare, databases, financial networks. He stops things before they happen. There was another giggle from Lila this time. Sounds like my IT guy. Elijah stood perfectly still. He didn't blink. And then Miss Abdul's Halbrook stepped in, not to stop the mockery, but to add to it. "And what exactly is your father's title, Elijah? Is he the director of the Pentagon?" Another chuckle floated through the room. Polite, damning. Elijah's jaw didn't tighten. His fists didn't clench. He simply said, "No." But his clearance is higher than most in that building. That should have been enough. But then Ms. Halbrook said it. The sentence that would echo in Elijah's head for years? "Well," she said lightly, "that's quite the imagination. Next time, let's try to stay grounded in reality, shall we?" She didn't mean it to be cruel. That's what made it worse. Because some of the worst violence is delivered gently with a smile. Elijah didn't move. No one applauded. No one looked at him with anything but a quiet consensus. He lied. Even Leo. His closest friend stayed quiet, not because he didn't believe Elijah, but because belief in rooms like this comes at a price most aren't willing to pay. Elijah returned to his seat. His hands trembled under the desk. No one noticed. And that should have been the end of it. But then, just as Ms. Halbrook turned to introduce the next child, the classroom door opened. A shadow fell across the threshold. Darius Carter stepped into the room, not with thunder, not with fanfare, just presence. He wore a tailored navy suit, the kind you'd never notice unless you knew how expensive discretion could be. His shoes didn't squeak, his steps didn't echo, but the energy changed. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The gold Pentagon badge clipped to his chest, caught the light and split the room in two. Miss Halbrook's voice died in her throat. For the first time all semester, she was speechless. Darius nodded at her, not out of respect, but acknowledgement. "I wouldn't miss it," he said calmly. She gestured awkwardly toward a seat at the edge of the room near the coats, and the old globe no one touched anymore. Darius looked at it, then looked at his son and chose a different chair, the one in the front row beside Elijah. It was not an act of defiance, it was an act of correction. The next few presentations stumbled. Some parents whispered, some stared. And then, once again, it was Elijah's turn. He rose slowly. This time, He didn't need to explain any more, but he did. My father doesn't just work at the Pentagon, he said. He's one of the reasons you haven't heard about certain attacks, because he stopped them before you could. He paused. He protects people you'll never meet, from threats you'll never see. The room fell silent, not from shame, but from something unfamiliar. Respect. Even if they didn't want to admit it, Miss Halbrook tried to recover. "Thank you, Elijah," she said tight-lipped. Then to Darius, "You must be very proud." Darius turned his head slightly. "I am. And what is it exactly that you do?" she asked, her tone trying for curiosity. Failing at control, Darius looked directly at her. "I lead strategic cyber defense operations. My work involves identifying foreign threats before they penetrate domestic systems, including those tied to private institutions like this one." She blinked. She understood. Not everything, but enough. And then the door opened again. A man in a dark suit leaned in, whispered something in Darius's ear, too soft to hear, but the shift in Darius's expression was undeniable. "Steele." "Excuse me," he said, standing. "I'll return shortly." And then he was gone. The air behind him hung thick. Parents whispered. Students stared. Miss Halbrook once. The master of this stage suddenly looked small. Elijah sat alone again, but this time he didn't feel alone, because truth had walked through the door, and the room would never see him the same again. At exactly 11 a.m., Fairmount Academy blinked. Not in the way humans blink, but digitally quietly. A single line of background code activated itself inside the school's server system, invisible to teachers, unnoticed by students, and indistinguishable from routine maintenance. It was a ghost designed to watch, not to touch, to listen, not to speak, but Darius Carter saw it. 3 miles away inside his secure home office, camouflaged as a reading den, his military-grade terminal lit up with a low, blinking alert. A reconnaissance ping, masked foreign and surgical in nature, had wormed its way through Fairmount's network firewall and initiated a sync attempt with at least 6 connected student devices. Darius stared at the blinking data string. Then at the time, 11:34 a.m., the same moment Elijah had stood in front of his classmates, told the truth, and been laughed at. Coincidence? Darius didn't believe in coincidence. He leaned forward, entering a silent flurry of commands. His fingers moved like memory fast, precise, confident. The intrusion. Signature was subtle, encrypted, bouncing through 5 global proxies: Singapore, Prague, Toronto, Johannesburg, and back through Madrid. Whoever launched the breach knew what they were doing. They weren't trying to cause damage. They were mapping homes, networks, behavioral patterns, targeting children connected to high-level national defense personnel. And on the list of queried names, the first one displayed on Darius's monitor was Elijah Carter. It wasn't just surveillance, it was targeting. Darius didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply stood, walked to the window of his office, and pulled the curtain aside. Across the street, parked exactly 47 feet from the Carter residence, was a black SUV, same as the night before. No plates, no movement, just presence. Not the kind that watched because it was curious, the kind that waited because it was calculating. Darius closed the curtain. He didn't call it in, not yet. Instead, he picked up a secure satellite phone from the hollowed-out spine of a law book and dialed a number buried beneath 5 layers of clearance. "Langley, it's Carter. Code red for local recon breach. Boston node, Fairmount Academy, foreign. Likely, possibly state-backed. Do you require deployment?" "Not yet." "What do you need?" "Access and silence." A pause, then acknowledged. Within 10 seconds, his terminal granted full uplink access to the school's internal network. Darius dove in, he found it fast. A disguise process had been embedded in a school admin account, someone with physical access to the school's back-end system. It wasn't just remote reconnaissance, it was insider-aided. Inside the building, inside the hallway where Elijah sat at that very moment. The program wasn't pulling grades or attendance logs. It was scraping MAC addresses, access history, family IP, overlaps, home connections. They were triangulating when and where children accessed home networks tied to government classified environments. They weren't stealing information. They were preparing an extraction. Darius's jaw tightened, and then it hit him. The code hadn't just been activated at 11:34 a.m. It had been activated during Elijah's presentation. This wasn't just cyber espionage. This was a trigger, an intentional response to Elijah revealing his father's job. They'd been waiting for confirmation. Now they had it. Darius closed the laptop slowly. He didn't need to say anything aloud to know the consequences. He reached into a desk drawer, retrieved a small silver object, an encrypted location beacon disguised as a flash drive, and slid it into his coat pocket. Then he walked to the hallway, pausing at Elijah's bedroom door. The door was open. Elijah sat at his desk reading over a robotics textbook. He looked up when his father approached. "You coming back to school today?" he asked. Darius nodded once. "Something wrong?" "Not if I can help it," Darius said. "Will you be at my class again?" "I'll be close." Elijah didn't press. He didn't need to. Some families communicated in sentences. They communicated in calibration. By the time Darius arrived back at Fairmount, the sun had moved higher in the sky, throwing long shadows across the marble steps. He didn't enter through the front. He used a secondary administrative entrance. Two federal agents met him in the West Corridor, disguised as maintenance personnel. One nodded silently, handing him a secure tablet. "Breach confirmed. Signal originated internally. We've quarantined access, but the process initiated a dormant secondary handshake with a signal booster. Location: one of the back classrooms, West Wing, near room 4B, Elijah's classroom." Darius didn't waste breath. "We go now." Outside room 4B, the hall was silent, too silent. The kind of silence you get when all sound is swallowed by anticipation. Darius gave the signal. The agents peeled off to the hallway ends, securing exits. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Halbrook had resumed the presentations. Her voice was thinner now, more hesitant. She kept glancing toward the door. Something about the way Darius had exited earlier, it had unsettled her. Elijah sat silently alert. He noticed it first. The flicker in the overhead lights, the projector screen stuttering mid-slide. And then the hallway outside went completely quiet. No footsteps, no voices, not even the usual hum of hallway motion. Then the intercom buzzed. But it wasn't Principal Meyer's voice. It was someone else, someone whose tone made the hair on Elijah's arms rise. "This is a security protocol. Notice, all students and staff are to remain in their current locations. This is not a drill." Gasps, murmurs. Then silence. Ms. Halbrook stood frozen, mouth open. Several students looked toward the door. "What's going on?" one whispered. "I'm sure it's just a mistake." "See," Halbrook said, reaching to close the blinds with visibly shaking hands. Then the classroom door opened again. Darius Carter stepped inside, but he wasn't a parent anymore. He was a sentinel. His badge was fully visible now, and two federal agents followed behind him. One stayed by the door, the other by the window. Darius's voice was calm, deadly calm. "Everyone stay seated." This building is under temporary security lockdown. There's been a breach attempt. What kind of breach? A father asked, his voice edged with alarm. Darius didn't blink. The kind you don't see until it's standing in the room. The classroom went dead silent. Ms. Halbrook opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Elijah's voice rose instead. Is this because of me? Darius turned to him. For the first time since entering, his expression shifted just a little. You didn't do anything wrong, he said quietly. But yes, they're after what I protect, and that includes you now. Another beat of silence. Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. What do? We stay calm, Darius said, and we don't give them what they came for. Then the second intercom alert hit. Suspicious activity detected near the west stairwell. Possible unauthorized internal access. Darius's eyes narrowed. He turned to the agents. Secure this room. No one in, no one out. Then, to Elijah. You stay here. Elijah opened his mouth to protest, but Darius cut him off with just a glance. Stay with your truth, he said, hand squeezing his son's shoulder. I'll handle the lies. Then he was gone, out into the hallway, toward the breach, and toward the ghost that had walked through the firewall, and into their lives. The stairwell was colder than it should have been, not because of temperature, but because of tension. Darius moved through the hallway with the kind of calm that only experience could craft, each step deliberate, each breath measured. He didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. His silence was already a warning. At the far end of the corridor, a man in a gray custodial uniform moved slowly, as if he belonged there, but his gait was too smooth, his hands too still. No mop, no cart, just a calm presence walking where it shouldn't be. Darius called out only once. You're not staff. The man turned. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile you only see from people who think they've already won. Didn't expect you so soon, he said. Darius didn't reply. He tapped the comm at his collar. Target confirmed west stairwell. Do not engage until instructed. The man stepped backward toward the fire door. You're a bit too late. He reached into his pocket. No gun. Worse, a small black device no larger than a flash drive. Darius didn't wait. He lunged. The hallway erupted into movement. The man bolted, slamming through the door at the end of the stairwell. Darius caught his arm just before the threshold. They crashed onto the concrete steps. The device skidded away. Pain bloomed across Darius's ribs, but he didn't flinch. The man fought back. Trained sharp. His elbow clipped Darius's chin, but Darius pivoted, drove his knee into the man's thigh, then pinned him face down on the landing. His breath was steady, his grip exact. Who sent you? Darius growled. The man didn't answer, just laughed. You think I'm the only one? Darius's jaw tightened. What was the device transmitting? Ask your son, the man whispered, smiling again. And then Darius saw it. The twitch in his cheek, the subtle clench of his jaw. A capsule, no too late. The man went still. His body shuddered, mouth slackened. A faint chemical burn filled the air. Cyanide. The threat was over, but the operation wasn't. Federal agents swarmed in seconds later. One grabbed the black device already running. Encryption overrides. Another looked to Darius. Is he? He's done talking, Darius said. Back inside room 4B, chaos was blooming beneath the surface. The students sat wide-eyed. Parents whispered, Ms. Halbrook clutched her tablet like it might protect her. But Elijah wasn't watching her. He was watching the man at the back of the room, the tech support assistant who hadn't said a word all day, the one who had seemed oddly out of place, but just familiar enough to blend in. That man moved suddenly. too fast. Elijah saw it. His hand slipped beneath the desk. A flash of something metallic. Not a weapon. A device. A signal scrambler. Before anyone could speak, Elijah leapt to his feet. Get down. The classroom went black. Lights off. Screens died. Tablets shut down. The projector froze mid-slide. Panic rippled. And then it escalated. The fake tech assistant lunged forward and grabbed Leo, Elijah's quiet classmate who had once stood up for him when others didn't. A stun baton crackled to life. One agent turned but was too slow. The baton struck his side. Elijah didn't hesitate. He launched himself at the man, not strong enough to overpower him, but just enough to break his grip on Leo. The boy stumbled free. The attacker turned, ready to strike Elijah this time. But the door burst open and Darius walked in like a thunderclap. No shout, no warning. One clean shot. The assailant crumpled. Silence fell again, but this time it was reverent. Agents poured into the room. Children screamed. Parents pulled their kids close. Ms. Halbrook backed against the whiteboard, her face pale and shaking. Darius ran to Elijah, hands moving fast over his shoulders, his arms checking for wounds. I'm okay, Elijah said. Breath ragged, I saw the breach. I recognized it. Darius froze. You what? The ghosted icon on the tablet. The one you showed me that night in your office. It was there. Elijah pulled the backup drive from his pocket, the one his father had given him weeks ago. I triggered the beacon. Darius didn't speak. He just looked at his son. Really looked. Not as a child, but as someone who had just saved lives. Later, as agents secured the school and press vans lined the front entrance, Darius and Elijah sat in the hallway outside room 4B. The world buzzed behind them. But here it was quiet. Was all this because of you? Elijah asked. Darius nodded slowly. Partly, but it was also because of you. Why me? Because you said my name, Darius replied. And because the people listening wanted to know if it meant what they thought it did. And now they do. Darius placed a hand on his son's shoulder. They weren't looking for files. Elijah. They were looking for futures, for leverage. Elijah looked down. Then we stopped them. Darius smiled, faint but real. No, you did. The headlines moved on within days. But Fairmount didn't forget. Neither did Elijah. The school brought in federal advisors, cybersecurity audits, clearance, verifications for all staff. Principal Meyer resigned under quiet pressure. Mrs. Halbrook submitted to a Department of Education ethics panel. She was cleared, but changed. Something in her had shifted. A silence now filled her praise, a pause in her assumptions. She asked Elijah to help lead a new student-run cybersecurity initiative. He agreed, not out of forgiveness but out of vision, because change doesn't begin with apology. It begins with access. 2 weeks after the attack, Darius stood before a joint congressional committee, intelligence directors, lawmakers, military brass. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand revenge. He presented evidence. The Tier A. A file 8 students from 8 schools, all children of national security officials. All tracked, all mapped, all targeted. This wasn't just espionage, he said. This was blueprint construction for kidnapping, for destabilization. The next breach won't happen on a battlefield. It'll happen through a school firewall, through an unlocked tablet, through a lie believed too easily. His words led to sweeping reforms, encrypted database protocols for all schools receiving federal funding, mandatory cybersecurity clearances for staff with access to student data, and a clause buried deep but powerful: under the Family Educational Privacy Act. Any institution with government-linked children must install breach detection systems funded by the National Security Education Initiative. They called Darius Carter a hero. He disagreed. The real hero, he said at the final press conference, was the kid who saw the signal, who remembered what his father taught him, and who acted while the rest of the room froze. Back home, Elijah watched it all from the couch, his mother beside him, a blanket over his shoulders. When Darius returned that evening, Elijah ran to him. They said, "You saved the country." Darius shook his head. They finally listened. That's all. So what happens now? Darius looked out the window. No SUV, no shadows, just light. Now, he said, we live, we stay sharp, and we make sure that if they come again, they know who they're coming for. On the last day of the semester, Elijah stood in the Fairmount Auditorium before students, parents, and teachers. He wore no suit, just a school uniform, freshly pressed. His presentation, a project called Digital Shadows, What Schools Don't Know Can Still Hurt Us. He told the whole story, from the classroom humiliation to the breach, from disbelief to proof. He spoke with clarity, not to shame, but to warn, to inspire. And when he finished, the auditorium didn't clap. They stood. Even Ms. Hallbrook, even Colton, and Darius in the back row felt something inside him uncoil for the first time in years. Not fear, not relief, but pride. Pride in a son who never needed to shout to be heard, who stood firm even when no one believed him, and who reminded the world that silence is not weakness. It's the space where courage gets ready to speak. Legacy beyond the firewalls. Elijah Carter's journey and what it teaches us all. Elijah Carter never asked to become the symbol of a deeper truth, but life doesn't wait for permission when it decides to make someone visible. His journey began in silence, crafted in the invisible space between survival and presence. A black boy in a predominantly white elite school, Elijah had already mastered the unspoken code of existing without being seen. He walked the halls of Fairmount Academy like a shadow, respectful, intelligent, unnoticed. But when his class was asked to present their parents' professions on Parents' Day, the story took a turn that neither Elijah nor the world around him was ready for. Elijah simply told the truth. My dad works at the Pentagon in cybersecurity operations. There was no arrogance in his voice, no embellishment, just the truth. But the classroom didn't applaud. They didn't lean forward in curiosity. They laughed. They doubted. They mocked. Because truth, when spoken by someone society doesn't expect to carry it, is often treated like fiction. Ms. Halbrook, the teacher, trusted to create safety in learning, smirked and dismissed his statement as fantasy. No questions, no follow-ups. Just a quiet, devastating assumption. Boys like Elijah don't come from fathers like that. But what they didn't know, what they had never cared to imagine, was that Elijah Carter wasn't alone. His father, Darius Carter, didn't work in maintenance or administration. He was a sentinel behind national security, a man whose silence was forged in fire and warfare, a strategist who didn't speak loudly because he never had to. And when Elijah was ridiculed in front of his classmates, Darius didn't respond with volume or vengeance. He responded with presence. He walked into that classroom, badge gleaming, shoulders squared, quiet, but undeniable. The moment was seismic, not because of how loud it was, but because of what it shattered. In that instant, Elijah was no longer the boy who lied. He was the boy who had dared to tell the truth to a room that refused to believe him. But the story didn't end with redemption. It was just beginning. Because at the exact time Elijah stood in front of that class, a foreign breach had penetrated Fairmount Academy's digital infrastructure. The attacker wasn't looking for test scores. They were looking for targets, children of high-level intelligence and security personnel. Elijah had unknowingly confirmed what those spies were hoping to hear. His father wasn't just a name. He was a doorway, a vulnerability, a key. Darius moved quickly. He accessed military networks, traced the breach signature, discovered it wasn't random. It was surgical, state-sponsored, and far more dangerous than any school ever imagined. The breach wasn't just digital, it was physical, and it was already inside. When the school went into lockdown, panic followed. But not for Elijah, because when the network went dark, when the lights failed, and a rogue infiltrator in disguise tried to initiate a kidnapping, Elijah remembered everything his father taught him. He recognized the breach signature, triggered a beacon, sacrificed safety to save a friend. And in that moment, Elijah Carter became more than a student. He became a protector. And when Darius burst into the room and neutralized the attacker, it wasn't just his gun that delivered justice, it was the legacy that walked behind it. A legacy built not just in code and combat, but in integrity, preparation, and the courage to tell the truth, even when no one believes you. After the breach, the school changed, so did the country. Darius's testimony led to new federal mandates around cybersecurity privacy and educational infrastructure. Schools were no longer considered neutral zones. They were battlegrounds in modern intelligence. Safeguards were installed. Policies were rewritten. And Elijah, he wasn't just invited to return to school, he was invited to lead it. He co-founded a student cybersecurity team not out of ego, but out of mission, because he understood what many adults still didn't. The most dangerous attacks don't start with violence. They start with disbelief. Elijah's closing semester presentation titled "Digital Shadows: What Schools Don't Know Can Still Hurt Us" was met not with hesitation, but with standing ovation. Even those who once doubted him stood, because they saw what they'd been unwilling to see before, that courage isn't just loud. Sometimes it's a quiet kid in the third row who refuses to shrink. What can we learn from Elijah Carter? The power of presence. Darius never stormed. He entered. And sometimes presence is louder than protest. In a world addicted to noise, stillness, backed by integrity, is revolutionary. The danger of assumptions. Miss Halbrook didn't attack Elijah with words. She wounded him with disbelief. How many times have we dismissed someone because of their background, their accent, their clothes, or their silence? This story reminds us bias doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles. Silence is not weakness. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't fight back. He stood still and let truth defend itself. And when the moment came for action, he didn't hesitate. His silence wasn't submission. It was discipline waiting for the right moment. Legacy is earned, not inherited. Elijah didn't ride on his father's name. He built his own with action, with empathy, with clarity. In the end, he wasn't just Darius's son. He was his own kind of sentinel. Speak truth even when it shakes. You may not be believed at first, but truth doesn't need immediate validation. It needs consistency. Prepare in silence. Just because no one sees your struggle doesn't mean your growth is invisible. Elijah was ready because he listened in the quiet. Question your first instinct. When someone shares something that seems too big, ask yourself, am I doubting them because of what they said or because of who I think they are? Stand with those who stand alone. Be the Leo, not the Colton. When you see someone being dismissed, show up. Your silence is complicity. If you were in Elijah's shoes mocked for telling the truth, what would you do? Stay quiet and move on. Stand firm and say it again, even if no one believes you. Comment. below with A or B and tell us why. Let's have an honest conversation in the comments. If this story moved you, please consider supporting our channel. Subscribe to help us grow and continue creating powerful, meaningful content that tells the stories no one else dares to tell. Comment and share to amplify these voices. Every interaction pushes this story into more people's hands. Donate if you believe stories like this matter. The early days of this channel are the hardest, but with your help, we can build something strong, truthful, and unforgettable. Together, we can shine a light on voices that refuse to be silenced and inspire a generation to walk in truth even when it hurts. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay powerful, stay kind, and never stop standing.